Hey everyone, in this video, we're going to go over basic testing in Django. So for this tutorial, I'm going to use the inventory management project we created in a previous series. I'll link the code for that in the description so you can grab that and get kind of our starting place. But all we have here is we have a couple models. We have a few different views, all class-based views, a template view, a generic view, another view here. Then we have our create, update, and delete views. And we're going to go through how to kind of test this. I'm not going to write tests for everything. I'm not going to have complete test coverage, but I want to go over just kind of like basic testing, and then you can probably replicate that for any view or model that you need. So first, we'll go over some basic testing, then we'll go over how to test the model, and then we'll test our views. So let's go ahead and get started with that. So we're going to put all of our tests inside this test.py. There are other ways you can set this up. You can create a test folder and those sorts of things, but to keep things simple in this tutorial, we're going to put everything in this test.py. So before we actually write any tests, let's go over how to run a test. So we can run a test by running python 3 manage.py test. And you'll see here, it will look for our tests, it will run them, and then it'll give us the results. In this case, of course, we didn't find any tests, we haven't wrote any yet. But this line right here is the most basic way you can write. You can run tests. There are other libraries and things you can install to do more advanced testing, but for basic testing, all you need to do is run python 3 manage.py test. And that's what we'll use for this tutorial for our testing here. So when we write a test, first thing we'll do is we'll create a class. So I'm going to create just a basic tests class first, basic tests, and we'll inherit from test case. This is a built-in Django class here that will give us some basic functionality. All this, I believe, is based off of the unit test library. So if you're familiar with that, this will be kind of similar. There are some extra things we can use here, though. I also want to go ahead right now, before I forget, I'll import client. This will give us like a fake browser client we can use to interact with our views to test out and make sure things are working correctly. Now let's go over how to write a basic test. So first thing we'll do is we'll create a function within our class, and we'll call this one test1, and we'll pass in self, and then here we can write our test. So typically how you test things is you write assert. So we'll do something like assert equals and see if two things are equal to each other, and if they're true, we'll return true. If not false, it'll fail the test. So we can do a self.assert, and we have various different options on here. We can do assert equals, we can do assert true, and there's more from there. But those are the two most common ones you'll probably use. I'll link the documentation so you can find the rest of them. But the way we'll use this, it will do assert true. The inside of the parentheses will pass in what we want to test. For example, we can test assert true 1 double equals 1. If I save this and then run our test again, python 3 manage.py test, you'll see we found one test. We ran that one test and it returns okay because we passed all the tests. Now, if we do another assert down in here, we do like assert self.assert true, and we pass something that's not true, 1 double equals 2, for example, this test should fail. This line here should fail. Back here, we'll run our test again, and you'll see here it did fail. Go ahead, actually clear this run up here so it's not as far down the screen. You'll see we have a fail. It tells us where it failed in test 1, and then down here we can find we have this assertion error. False is not true. So it's saying false is not true because this returned false. This line in here did, and that is not true. So this test here failed. That's kind of the basics of testing. We'll write our code. We'll run our code, and then we'll check that certain values are true or false, and make sure that things are returning the way we expect them to. That's kind of how testing is handled. Of course, you can go super advanced in testing, get into like mocking and those sorts of things. But for basic testing, this is all we really need, or just we're gonna run some code and run some asserts to see if they're true or not. Let's go ahead now and write another type of test, this time using a try except statement. So this is one way we can do it, but we can also write try excepts to handle testing as well. So we'll do a test 2, pass in self, and then here we'll put a try except statement. So we'll do try, and we'll do something like we can do print hello, and then we can do except exception. So we throw an exception as E, then we can go ahead and just fail the test. So if we get an exception during this code, we can just say, okay, this failed. We can do a self.fail to fail a test, passing in the exception to be able to see what the exception was. We save that, we run this code. We ran 2 tests this time. It found both of our tests, and they both ran okay because all we did here was just print to the screen and nothing nothing failed, and we see hello up here after it ran that test. So that all worked well. But let's go ahead and see what happens if we raise an exception. So let's just pretend we get an exception. We can kind of mock that with raise exception. We pass in a message, failure in test 2. And then now this will raise an exception, which should then run this except block. We'll fail it, pass in the exception, and we should see this message on the screen when we fail. So now back here, run it again, and you'll see here we got a fail on test 2. Here's our traceback, and then we get exception, failure in test 2. And then down here, you'll see we have an exertion error saying failure in test 2 because we have this exception here. So we can either run code and try excepts, or we can run assertions here without the try except based on what you need. If you need to catch an error, you can catch it, using a try except like you normally would. Just want to go over kind of how to use that as well. But now that we've kind of gone over how to set up basic tests, let's go ahead and write some real actual tests now. These are kind of just good examples to get you started, but they're not actually very useful in real life. So the first thing we'll test is our models. So I'm going to go ahead and just write a test just for this inventory item model. So what we want to check here is we want to check that if we create an object, we want to check that there is an instance of this object with these values, and we want to check that when we create it, whatever is created is an instance of this class. So really we just want to check that we are correctly creating an instance of this class, and we are setting the attributes correctly when we create it. And of course, there's more things we could test here. We could test these different methods on the class. We could test other things. We could test what happens if we don't pass in data, make sure certain things, certain qualities act the way we expect them to. But I'm not going to go over every single possibility here. You probably should in your real test, but for this basic example, we won't do that. So let's go ahead and test our model now. So what we'll do is I'll go ahead and create another class, and I'll say test models as in test case. And now inside of here, we're going to go ahead and once again create another function to run our test. So we'll do test underscore model inventory item, passing in self as an argument there. And then down here, first we'll go ahead and create a new inventory item. So we'll do inventory item equals inventory item, which we want to make sure we import before I forget. So up here at the top, do from .models import inventory item. But now down here, we have our inventory item. Let's go ahead and create it. So we'll pass in our data right here. So we'll do a name equaling test item, quantity equaling 10. And just in case you're not familiar, I'm just filling in each of these fields here. So everything except date created, because we have auto now add to true. This will be set automatically. We don't actually have to pass it in when we create it. So I'm gonna go ahead and set name, quantity, category, and user on this item here. So we have our name, our quantity, and then for category and user, of course, we need an actual category and user object to be able to set those. So I'll need to go ahead and create those as well. So I can do a self.user equals user.objects and we can do create underscore user to create a user. That's a built-in function with Django. And then we can do username equals test user and just give it a fake password. Password equals password. And then we go ahead and create our category as well. So we can do a self.category, or we don't really need to put these as self yet. We'll get to that in a second. Let's just put category. So user and category. Category equals category dot objects dot create, like we would normally create a Django model object. And then I'll go ahead and just pass in a name equaling test category, because if we look at our models here for our category model, we just have one name attribute field. So we'll just set that inside of this constructor here. And there we go. So now let's go ahead and import user and category. So category comes from our same models file, and then we can get our user from django.contrib.auth.models import user. And there we go. So now we can set our user and category based off of this. So I can just put, user equals user, and then category equals category. Just like that. And we'll save that. Now that we have a inventory item created, we can go ahead and test. And actually, I just realized I forgot something here. Inventory item.objects.create. Don't forget that part there. But now that we have an inventory item created in our database, we can go ahead and run our assertions to check and see if the values on this item are set correctly. So we can do a self.assert equals. And what we'll do is we'll take an str of the inventory item. Look at our models here. We overrode the str function here to return self.name. So when we get a string representation of this model, it should be just the whatever set in this name attribute. So we can check here if we have that. So we'll do str inventory item. We can check that, does this equal this name up here? So we can test, does this equal test item? We can also check, is this inventory item correctly created as an instance of this inventory item class? So we can do a self.assert true in this case is instance, which is a built-in function in Django or in Python to check the instance of the class, check what class this is an instance of. And we can do inventory item, comma, and the class we want to check. So we pass in the instance first, and then we pass in the actual class name, which is inventory item. So now we're doing assert equals. So we're taking these two values, this one right here and this one, and it's checking to see if they're equal to each other. And then we're taking assert true, and we're checking, does this return true? Is instance will return true or false if this instance is an instance of this class. So this will return true or false. We want to make sure this is true, saying that this instance is an instance of our inventory item class. Let's go ahead and save this now and run this code. And now we'll see we ran two tests, and they both ran okay. So our two tests would have been this basic test here, as well as the test models. I'm going to go ahead and just comment out this basic test class now because it's not really doing much, and it just kind of makes our tests a little more messy. But I'll leave the code here so you can look at it for reference. Let's go ahead and run this again, and we should get this one test run, test model inventory item. Let's go ahead and just double check that. And we get run test, and it ran okay. So we were able to correctly create an inventory item, and the str representation is set to the name, and it is an instance of our inventory item class. So that works well, but if we had a bunch of different tests, we see we're doing lots of things we might reuse. We create a user, we create a category, and then we're creating an inventory item using those two values. But maybe we need a user and category for like 5 or 6 tests. Now we have to copy this down for each test. We could do that, but there's also a better way of handling this. Inside this test case class, there is a built-in method called setup, and we can override this setup method, and this will run before every test. So I'll just put a little comment here. I'll just say setup for each test. And so this will run before we run each test. And so some things like creating the user or the category, that can be handled in a setup function, and then we can go ahead and just use it in the rest of our test cases that way, instead of having to rewrite the code over and over again. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy these two lines, this user and category. I'm going to put them up here. And then I'm going to change this, because we want to make this an instance variable instead. So we want to make sure we put self.user and self.category. That way we can use them in our other functions. And now, of course, down here, we want to change this to self.user and self.category. Let's go ahead now and run our test again. And if this works, we should still see the same result. If it fails, then we'll know something is wrong. So let's go ahead and run this one more time. And it ran okay. So we correctly use our setup function to kind of put our setup code in a different setup function and then just use it in our other test cases. In this example, it may not seem very necessary because we only have one test, but in future examples, you'll see why this is very helpful when we have 4 or 5 or 6 different test functions within one class. Well, that covers kind of a basic model test. You could take this further and test other things. You could test other models. You could test different functions on the model and those sorts of things. But you follow the same sort of structure. Usually, if I were to look at a test, I would write my setup code, if I have any inside the function setup code, and then I'd write the logic to test, and then the assertions. So this is kind of the order that you're following. First this, then we're doing this, then we're doing this. So if you want to look at it as a structure for your tests, this is how I would do it. Any setup code, write the logic you want to test, and then write some assertions that kind of assert what this logic should return. So that's kind of how we're going to set up all of our tests just like that. Let's go ahead now and jump into testing views. So I'm going to go down to the bottom and create a new class. We'll do a class, just do test views, passing in test case. And then once again, we're going to set up this test case or this test views class the same sort of way. We're going to have a setup function. Just put our setup code in, and I'll put a pass for now. Then we're going to go ahead and put our test cases down here. So we're going to test kind of down the list of our views here. I'm not going to test all of them, but you'll get kind of an idea. I'm going to test the index template view. I'm going to test the dashboard, which is just a generic view with this get method to return the dashboard. So we're going to check that it correctly returns the correct template with the correct response. I'm going to skip the sign-up view for now. You could test that if you wanted to. Then I'm going to test the add item, this generic CreateView, that we're able to use this view to add an item to our database. I'm going to test the edit item and then the delete item. So let's start here at the top and test our index view. So we'll create a test case for this. We'll do a def test underscore index, and I like to put the method we're testing after that as well, the HTTP method, just so it makes it clear. So we'll test the get method, and we'll pass in self as a parameter. And now there's a few things we need to do here. First, we need to do is mock the response. And then we want to go ahead and write assertions, just like that. So the way we mock the response is we can use this client up here. This client class will give us kind of like a fake browser to use to send requests to our views to kind of test to see if it's working the way we expect it to. So inside my setup method, I'm going to create an instance of this client. So I'm going to create a self.client equals an instance of the client. Now we can use this self.client to call, the get method, post, put, delete, whatever you want to call, to make it to send the HTTP method to that view and test the logic. So now we have this client, we can go ahead and mock the response. So what we'll do is we'll write response equals self.client.get, and then we want to pass in some sort of URL. You can just pass in, just like / to do just the root, which is our index page. Or what would be a little better would be at the top here, we can import from Django.urls, import reverse. And then down here, inside of my setup class here, I'm going to keep my URLs up here. So we'll do self.index URL equals reverse index. And index comes from the URLs.py. We have a name of index, which is mapped to just the root. So it's the same thing as what we had before with this, but this just keeps it a little cleaner, and in my opinion, it's a little better this way. So then instead of here, we'll do self.index URL, get that response. Now let's go ahead and just print the response and see what we get. So we get this template response, status code 200, text HTML, char set. So we can use this to test two things. It's a template response, so we can test to see what template was rendered, and we can test the status code. So in this case, this is just a GET request. We're hoping to get just a status code of 200, and then our template response, we can look at our code here, and we can go to our views and our index, our template name. We can check that inventory/index.html is the template being rendered. So let's go into our test now and write the assertions. So first we'll do the self.assert equals, and we'll do response.status code, and we'll assert that equals 200. And then we can do a self.assert And we'll use a new one this time called template use, which is a built-in Django assertion here. And we can test the response and see if the template that's rendered was inventory/index.html. Let's go ahead and run this test and see what happens. And ran 2 tests, and they both passed. So we were able to double check and verify that the response code was 200 and that we used our index.html template. If I were, for example, to pass in a different template, like our dashboard template, which we'll test next, and then run this test, you can see what will happen. Actually, clear this out, do it again. You see we got a fail, and to give us the name of the test that failed, our test index kit. This traceback here will show us down here an assertion error. Also not true. Template inventory dashboard HTML was not a template used to render the response. And then what's very helpful here is it tells us the actual template used right here, which was inventory/index.html. And we also have these other templates here because we are using a base template as well as putting some other navigation in a separate template. But you can ignore those for now. If you have just one template, it'll show up just this one right here. So since we're able to tell that, in fact, we're running a different template than what we were expecting. But in this case, index is the correct template, so we'll leave it like that. I'll run the test again just to verify it still works. And it does, so now we can go ahead and move on to our next test. Next, we'll go on to testing the dashboard page. So in this application, we have this little dashboard page that shows all of our inventory items for this user. All it has, if you look in our views, is just this generic view method here with this get method. So we can just run a get method here, and we should then get all of our items through this logic and then render it to the page. We could write multiple tests to test different pieces of logic, but in this case, let's just test that it does in fact render the dashboard template with a 200 response. But you'll notice one thing here, it's a little different about this view compared to the index view. We're passing in the login require mixin. So if we're not logged in, this test is not going to run as expected. We will get a 302 redirect, and redirect us to the login page instead of a 200 response on the dashboard page. So I'm going to write the response ignoring this for now so you can see how it will fail. And then I'll show you how to correctly log in a user and use that user to then get the correct response afterwards. So we'll do a test of test dashboard _ get, testing in self. Once again, we'll get the response. Response equals self.client.get. And then we want to go ahead and create a new URL up here, self.dashboard URL equals reverse dashboard. And that comes from our URLs. We have a name of dashboard for that URL, which maps to just dashboard. Now we have that URL, we can go ahead and put it inside this get call here. So we'll do self.dashboard _ URL. Okay, and now let's go ahead and write our assertions. So our assertions will be almost the same as this. I'm going to go and just copy this up here. I'll paste it right here. The only difference is now we want to change this here to dashboard. Now let's go ahead and run this test, and we'll see that's going to fail this assertion up here because it's not going to return a 200 response. We get an error saying response is not defined. I think I made a mistake here. I did. Okay, let's fix this real quick. So I misspelled response. Let's go ahead and try this one more time. And now we get a fail saying assertion error 302 does not equal 200. Now you may wonder, like, okay, so why is it returning 302 instead of 200? Well, the reason for that is because it's redirecting us to our login page. The way we have our, the way login required mixin works is that if you're not logged in, it will redirect you to the login page and then redirect you back once you log in. And 302 is a redirect. We'll see those more later on in some other views. But for this example, that just means we need to make sure our user is logged in before we try getting this response. And there is a built-in way to do this. I'm going to put this inside the setup method up here. So what we need first is another user. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy this first line right here to create a new user. And then once we have a user, we can go ahead and call a new function to log them in. And that function is self.client.login, passing in our username equaling test user and our password equaling our test password, which is just password in this case. And now that their user is logged in, we can go ahead and just run this view with that user because they'll be the user logged in, and we should not get this 302 error issue anymore. Now you see we ran 3 tests and they all passed successfully. So we were able to correctly show that if they're not logged in, this will happen. We could also write another test if you want to test what happens if they're not logged in. So this would be a good way to test other types of situations. So we could do a test dashboard get user not logged in. That's a very long function name. I'm gonna go ahead and just shorten it down a little bit. Not logged in. And now, of course, one issue here will be that it's going to run this login line right here and log the user in before we actually get to this line here. And so what we need to do first is we want to make sure we log out this user for this one test case. We could move this into we could move this login line to just this one test, but I need it for other tests. So I'm going to leave it there and instead just call the log out function to log the user out before we run this test. So we can do a self.client.log out, and then we can do response equals to get a response, self.client.get. Once again, we can do a self.dashboard URL, and then we'll run our assertion. So first, self.assert equals, it should return a 200 response. So we'll do response, or sorry, not a 200 response, a 302 response. So we do response.statuscode 302, make sure we're getting that correct response. And now if we get a 302 response, we'll know that we did in fact redirect to a login page and is not letting the user through to this dashboard page without being logged in. So we can test that logic here. So we come back here, we run the test, found all 4 tests, and then it ran all 4 and they all passed successfully. So that is how we can test different situations. You want to go ahead and make sure you test all the different things that could happen, and you want to put them in separate test functions just to keep things clear. Best practices when writing unit tests will have you keep only test one thing per function. That way you can easily tell what breaks in there. But that covers our dashboard tests. Let's go ahead now and test our create item, our edit item, and our delete item. And I'm not going to cover every situation that could happen, so I'm not going to try to say these are complete test coverage or anything like that. But hopefully this will give you an idea how to test these generic views and using different posts or using different HTTP methods than just a get call. So let's go ahead and start by creating an add item test here, and it'll be a post call as itself. So let's take a look at this view and see what we're testing first. So looking at our views here, you'll see our add item view right here. We have a login required mixin, so we need a user logged in, which we've already handled that, so that should be good. And we have a create view. So this generic create view will handle a post request and it'll create a new item, add to the database. You see we're using a form, we have a template here, and we have a redirect once we succeed. So looking at this, we want to test a few different things. First, we can test that a model is created correctly. We can test that a template is rendered, or really we can test just at the end, we can test that we did redirect correctly after being created successfully. So let's go ahead and first we'll check the status code, make sure it's a 302, that we did correctly redirect. You can see it's reverse lazy, that means we're redirecting. We'll also go ahead and test that we did in fact create a new model instance and that the attribute does match the post data passed in. So let's go and just write out here and hopefully it'll make more sense once we do that. So first, we already are logged in, so we can do response equals self.client.post. And just to make sure that makes sense, we're still logged in because we only call the logout inside this one function here. So we'll run this setup again before our next test. And so we'll re-log in, so we don't have to worry about logging in again. And now for a post method, this will look slightly different though. First, we want to add a new URL. So we'll up here inside of our setup function, we'll do self.add item URL equals reverse, just add dash item, which of course comes from our URLs. We have this add item name right here. And then we'll go ahead and post to that URL, self.add item URL. But we also want to pass in some post body data as well. And this will have the add item, the information to add to our inventory item model instance. So looking at that model here, we need to make sure we set all the same fields, name, quantity, category, and user, just like we did up here when we created an inventory item. I'm going to go ahead and actually copy this inventory item and put it inside of this setup function here as well, because we'll need this for when we test our other views. But this will change the number of items in our database, so we want to make sure we have this in before we write any of our other tests, just so we don't have to rewrite any tests later on. So we're going to just create another inventory item. So we have one in the database already. We want to check that there are now two after we run this view, and that the attributes here are set correctly. So now that we do this, I'm going to go ahead and just copy our data here. I want to paste it right here. Now, of course, you got to make a few changes here, though. All these need to be in quotes. And then these will be colons because we're creating a dictionary now instead. We'll do things just like this. And then also what we want to do is we want to do .id at the end of all of these. We don't want to pass the actual instance in. We want to get the actual ID and pass that in instead. Just like how we would pass in the post data if we were to make an API call to this view through like Postman or something. We want to make sure we pass in just the ID number instead of some instance to a class. But now that's set up, that should be ready to go. Let's go ahead now and check that we did create things correctly. So once this runs, we should get a 302 response, and we should now have two items in the database. One item with this information, and one item with this information up here from our setup function. Just so we can tell the difference, I'm going to change these two values here. We'll do test item 2 and 15. But now let's go ahead and write our assertions. So we'll do a self.assert equals, and first we'll check just the status code. That's the easiest one to do. Response.status code. And we check that we did correctly redirect, so we have a 302 response. Next, we want to go ahead and count all the inventory items in the database. We should find 2. So we'll do self.assert equals inventory item.objects.count, which is just a built-in method to count the objects. We want to check that is equal to 2. Finally, we want to do a self.assert equals inventory item.objects.last, being the most recent one we have, which should be this one right here. And let's go ahead and just check one of the attributes. We could check our quantity, we could check our name. In this case, we'll check just the name. So do objects.last.name. We want to check this is equal to our name right up here. So I'm going to go and just copy this and paste it right there. So just to double check and kind of go over this one more time, we're checking 3 things. First, we want to check the status code of 302, because in our view, at the very end of our view here, we are returning, where is it? Right here, a success URL. We're returning a redirect to the dashboard page, so we should get a 302 response there. Next, we're checking assert equals number of inventory items in the database. We're counting them with this count method. It should be 2. One of them being this one right here, and one of them being this inventory item created in our setup function up here. Finally, we're taking the last item, which should be this one right here. We want to assert that these attributes are correct. And so in this case, we're checking just this first one. We're checking the name. Does the name equal test item 2? Hopefully that makes sense. If not, let me know and I'll try to help explain it better. But that's all we're doing there. Let's go ahead now and run this test. So we got an error here, self.category. That would be because I copied in this inventory item, but I did not actually copy in the category. So this is failing because there's no category object. So I need to go ahead and grab this category up here as well and put that right here. I'm also going to make one more change. I did not make this instance field here. Let's go ahead and put this We'll make this self.inventory item just for future use. Right now it doesn't matter, but I completely forgot to add the category, so make sure you have the category there as well. Let's go ahead now and rerun this again. Okay, so we ran all 5 tests and they all passed successfully. So we were able to correctly check these 3 things, these 2 things right here, on our post method. And that works great. Let's go ahead and check what happens if we run our post method, but with no data passed in. So instead of having all this data here, we're gonna have no data. We want to check that nothing's actually added. It should return 2 response, and the count should still be 1. So we're just checking that it is correctly returning the response we're expecting, and it's not adding any weird empty object to the database or anything. So we'll do a def test item post no data, passing in self again, and then I'm going to go ahead and just copy this whole test case because it's going to be almost the same. And then we'll go ahead and first remove our data because we want to check if there's no data. And then we're going to go ahead and remove our last line here because we don't have any attributes to check because it shouldn't create anything. And then we want to change our count to 1, and our response status code we should expect 200 instead of 302. Now, if we run this test here, we ran 6 tests, they all passed. And just to show what happens if we pass in the wrong data here, say we forgot to change that and kept 302. We ran that, you should see assertion error showing that we got a 200 instead of a 302 right here. So in this case, you can see that we're getting a 200 and we were saying we were expecting a 302. So in this case though, 200 is correct, so we'll change it back to 200. So now we correctly tested 2 different possibilities with our add item. You could test more, but for now, I'm gonna leave it at that for that view. Now we have two more tests we're gonna write. One for our edit item and one for our delete item. And I'm not gonna cover all the possibilities for these. I just wanna write 2 simple tests just so you can see how this would work. But really, it follows the same sort of pattern. So what we'll do is we'll create a new test case here. Do test edit item post, passing in self. And this one will once again, we'll do a response. And I'm actually just to keep things a little quick, I'm gonna copy this response right here and paste it right there. And then I'm gonna change a few things here. So I'm gonna change the name here. I'm gonna do updated test item. And we'll leave everything else like the same. So we'll do 10 and keep that the same there. And so we need to change this URL to an edit item URL. Now this URL is gonna be a lot different though, because the way we have our URL set up for this edit item, we're passing in an ID into the actual URL. So we need to somehow reverse to that by passing in an ID, and then we can go ahead and run this. So I want to go ahead and test this first one we created. So if we go back to our test here, I want to change this one right here, the self.inventory item. So somehow we need to get this ID and pass it into the URL. And this is pretty easy with a reverse function. We can do a self.edit item URL equals reverse edit item. We pass in args equaling, and then we can grab this inventory item right here, self.inventory item.id. And that will pass in our primary key into our URL for us. So now we're going to be updating this item here. We should see after the test runs that this name goes from test item to our new name of updated test item. So let's go ahead and write some assertions to see if that works correctly. Self.assert equals, and first we'll check the status code, like we do in all of them, response.status code. Once again, this should redirect us back to the previous page. So we should be receiving a 302 response. Self.assert equals, and we'll check that first item. So we'll do inventory item.objects.first. We'll check the name there. Does the name equal this new updated name instead of the previous name? I'll put this here in quotes. Just like that. And then finally, we want to check that we did in fact update this one and we didn't create a new one or anything. So we should still see only one object in our database. So this this method here should not be creating a new one. It should be updating an existing one. And when we can assert that by doing a self.assert equals inventory item.objects.count set to 1. So we're checking the status code. We did correctly redirect. We're checking that our attributes from this data was correctly updated. And we're checking that we're not creating a new object, but we're actually updating an existing one. Let's go ahead now and run this test and see what happens. Oh, I forgot my comma inside of this up here. Where is it? Oh, it's up in our URLs way up here. Okay, so I must have just forgot something. Yeah, I forgot to put a comma right here. Okay, let's try it again. Okay, so they all ran correctly, which is good. Now, real quickly, I want to show what happens if we mess something up, because sometimes it's not super clear on what happened. So let's say we forgot to put our ID. Say we passed in just an instance instead of the ID into this field here. If I go back and run this test, it won't be very clear what happened. So let's run this real quick. So you'll see that our assertion failed for our status code, but all we got was a 200. We didn't get anything else. And so looking at that, it's kind of confusing. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So what happened was that when we called this view, we passed in this data. But this data is invalid. And so it's returning a 200, telling us what happened, but we can't see that from our testing. So if you're getting a 200, I would double check your URL, and I would double check your form data here. If you pass in some wrong data, or if you're missing a field, those sorts of things, that can cause this weird error. So I would double check this. In this case, it's just these issues right here. We passed in some sort of foreign key field. You don't want to pass in just the instance. You want to pass in the actual ID of that instance. And that's different than how we use our objects.create. You'll see up here, we pass in the instance for the objects.create. But for our JSON form, post body, we don't want that. We want the actual ID. This will be .id. It took me a while to figure out when I first got that error, so I want to make sure to go over that in case someone else was having the same issue. That's your problem right there. Make sure you pass in the actual ID and not just the instance of the model that we're putting in this related field here. But now with that done, we'll run the test one more time just to verify that they are working again. And they are. Okay, so that works well. We now have our edit item working as expected. We did update our item, and it didn't create any weird extra item in our database. Okay, let's go ahead and write one more test, and we'll go ahead and wrap this video up. So this last one will just test our DeleteView. Delete item. And this will call the delete method as in self as an argument. And then down here, once again, we'll get a response. Response will equal self.client.delete. And we need to go ahead and create our DeleteView URL as well. And just like our edit item view, our delete item view also passes in a primary key into the URL. So we need to make sure we add that in as well. So we'll go up here to where we're creating our URLs. We'll do a self.delete item URL equals reverse delete item. And then once again, we'll do the same args as before. This one right here. And we'll save that. We'll come back down to the bottom here, and we'll pass in delete item or self.delete item URL. We don't need any other data. And then we can go and just write our assertions. So in this case, since we're deleting an item, we want to make sure that we return to 302 again because we're deleting the item and redirecting back to a different page. We also want to go ahead and assert that there are no longer any inventory items in our database. So we can do a self.assert equals response.status code of 302. And then we can go ahead and do a self.assert equals inventory item.objects.count of 0. Let's go ahead now and run this test and see how this works. Okay, perfect. So we ran all 8 tests now, and it did work, and we did not get an error, so everything there worked well. So we were correctly able to show that we deleted the item, that we got the correct response, and we no longer have any items in the database because we deleted it. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this video here. Hopefully it gives you an idea how to write tests. Really, we're following just the same structure up here in all of them. We're doing any setup code, which is not always necessary, but if it is, we do that first. Then we write any logic to test. In this case, for most of these, that's just getting the response. And then after that, we can go ahead and write our assertions, which is, checking the status code, checking the template, maybe checking the assert equals on the database, that the database was updated as we expected. But that's all we really need to do there. And that's how we write all those tests. Of course, this is nowhere near sufficient. We should probably test our forms. We could have other scenarios we could test on our views and those sorts of things. But hopefully this gets you started on how to write tests. There is one other thing that I wanted to make sure I noted, though, before we end this video. On this test edit item, depending on your view, you may need to run one more function to update the database or refresh the database if you're not getting the correct response. So if this is an issue for you where this item is not updated as you expect it to be, go ahead and try running self.inventory item, or your name of whatever your instance in the database is, .refresh from DB. And if you're getting some errors, this might fix it. I just want to make sure that was noted as well. If we run our test, things should still work as expected. Go and just test that real quick. Yep, it still runs as expected. But if you're getting an error where like the database wasn't being updated, maybe try this line just to see if that fixes your problem. But that's really it. That covers basic unit testing in Django. Of course, there's much more advanced topics we could cover, but this will get you started hopefully writing at least some tests so you can have some test coverage over your code and help prevent any unnecessary bugs being an issue within your code. I'll go and put all the links in the description below, links to documentation. I'll put links to the code before and after these changes so you can follow along there. I'll put anything else that might be useful down there. But thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.